My name is Diane Calloway. I'm 38 years old. The morning after my mother's funeral, I drove to the house I grew up in and found a locksmith's van parked in the driveway. Gerald, my mother's husband of 6 years, had called them at 7 in the morning, before the casseroles people had brought to the reception were even cold. I stood on the porch of the house on Sycamore Lane and watched a man I had never met before change the lock on the front door of my childhood home. And Gerald stood behind the storm door, watching me watch it happen, and he did not come outside. He did not come outside. I called him 11 times that afternoon. He answered once. He said, and I want you to hear these words exactly as he said them, "Diane, this is a legal matter now. You should speak to an attorney." What Gerald did not know, what he could not have known, because my mother had told no one, was that 3 years before she died, she had walked into a title company on Morrison Street in Portland, Oregon. And she had quietly, without ceremony, without telling a single person in our family, added my name to the deed of that house. I didn't know she had done it either. Not until I opened her cedar box. Before I tell you what happened when I brought that document to Gerald's attorney, hit like, subscribe, and let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand what that piece of paper meant, you need to understand what that house meant. And you need to understand who Gerald really was, long before he ever showed his hand. Let's start at the beginning. I want you to understand something before anything else in this story. The house on Sycamore Lane was not a grand house. It was not the kind of house that people drove past and admired. It was a 1,400 square foot craftsman bungalow in northeast Portland with a covered front porch that listed slightly to the left because my father had built the railing himself in 1987, and he was, by his own admission, a better electrician than he was a carpenter. The paint was a shade of sage green that my mother had picked from a fan of color chips spread on the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening in 1991. I was 4 years old. She held each chip up to the window light and squinted at it, and when she got to the sage green she said, simply, "That one. That's the one." And she set it down, and that was that. My mother's name was Ruth Calloway, née Harmon. She was born in Medford, Oregon in 1952, the second of 4 children, and she moved to Portland when she married my father, Dennis, in 1979. She was 27. He was 31. He worked for the city electrical infrastructure, which is a very unsexy job that is also load-bearing for every city on Earth. A fact he enjoyed pointing out at dinner parties, until my mother would touch his arm and change the subject with the practiced grace of a woman who loved her husband completely and found him slightly exhausting. My father died in 2003. Heart attack. He was 55 years old and he had been in good health, or so we all thought, and then on a Wednesday morning in April, he sat down at the kitchen table with his coffee and his crossword, and he did not get up again. I was 17. My brother Kevin was 21 and already out of the house, living in an apartment in Beaverton with a roommate and working at a shipping depot. After my father died, it was just my mother and me in the house on Sycamore for a year, and then I went to college in Eugene, and then I came back, and then I went to work for a law firm downtown as a paralegal, which is a fact that will become relevant later, I promise. And I found my own apartment 12 minutes away, and my mother and I settled into the rhythm of adult women who are also mother and daughter, and also, somewhere in the long years since I stopped needing her for everything, had become something closer to friends. I had Sunday dinners at her house, every Sunday. This was not a rule we had discussed. It was something that happened and then continued happening because neither of us wanted it to stop. She would make whatever she felt like making: pot roast in winter, a cold green bean salad with almonds in summer. Once, memorably, an attempt at Thai green curry that she had seen on a cooking show, which was technically edible, but which we agreed never to speak of again. I would bring wine, or flowers from the farmer's market on Saturdays if I had gotten there in time. We would sit at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table where she had held up the paint chip in 1991, and we would talk for 2 or 3 hours about nothing and everything. Her garden, my cases at work, whatever book she was reading, whether the Blazers were going to be any good that year. The house on Sycamore Lane smelled like cedar and old wood, and on Sunday evenings, whatever my mother had been cooking since 2 in the afternoon. The porch light was always on when I pulled up. Always. Even in summer when it was still light outside, she turned it on anyway. She said it was so I could always find my way. She said it the first time as a practical statement. After a while, it became a kind of ritual declaration. The light is on. You are expected. You are wanted here. I want you to hold that image for a while. The porch light on. My mother in the kitchen. The house on Sycamore Lane exactly as it had always been. Because that is the version I return to, even now. My father left a will. It was straightforward. The house went to my mother outright. There was no complexity, no dispute, no family drama. Kevin and I were mentioned, but the house was hers. My father was very clear about that. He told her once, in a conversation she repeated to me years later, that the house was the thing he was most proud of building with her, and that wherever he went, it would always be hers to stay in. That was the word he used. Stay. Like he knew, on some level, that he was the one who might leave first. So after 2003, the house on Sycamore Lane belonged to Ruth Calloway. And for 7 years, that was simple and uncomplicated and fine. And then, in 2010, my mother met Gerald Fitch. I want to be fair to Gerald Fitch, because fairness matters to me, professionally and personally. I work with attorneys. I know that the story is almost never as simple as one person being a monster from the first moment. And the truth is, in the beginning, Gerald Fitch was not monstrous. He was charming. That is not a compliment in retrospect, but I mean it descriptively. He had the kind of charm that feels effortless because it has been practiced for a very long time. He was 61 when my mother met him at a garden tour organized by the neighborhood association. One of those events where people open their backyard gardens to visitors, and everyone walks around saying things like, "Oh, what a lovely specimen," about other people's hydrangeas. Gerald had moved into a house 4 blocks away after his own first wife passed, and he had, genuinely, as far as I could tell, a beautiful garden. My mother came home from that tour talking about the man with the Japanese maple and the raised herb beds. She mentioned him again the following week. By month 2, she had introduced him to me over coffee at her kitchen table, and I had found him perfectly pleasant. He was tall, silver-haired in the way that reads as distinguished rather than old. He had an easy laugh and opinions about Oregon wines, and a habit of touching the back of his own neck when he was thinking, which struck me as an oddly boyish gesture for a man his age. He was recently retired from a career in commercial real estate, which is also a fact that will become relevant later. And he had a son, Gregory, from his first marriage, who lived in Sacramento and whom he spoke of warmly but infrequently. Gerald and my mother dated for about 14 months. They were happy together as far as I could see. He took her to the coast. He cooked for her real cooking, not from a box. He was attentive and present, and my mother, who had been alone for 7 years, and who had, I now understood, been lonely in ways she would never have said aloud, was genuinely lighter in a way that made me feel relieved for her. I liked Gerald Fitch for about the first year and a half. I want to remember that. I liked him. My mother was happy. I thought this was a good thing. They got married in June of 2011 at the house on Sycamore. Small ceremony, 20 people, my mother's hydrangeas in bloom, her sister Carol flying in from Medford, my brother Kevin coming down from Beaverton in a shirt that needed ironing. I wore a blue dress. I took photographs. I cried a little during the vows and tried to pretend it was allergies. My mother wore a cream-colored linen dress, and she looked, I thought, genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy. Gerald moved into the house, on Sycamore Lane, the following month. This is where the story actually begins, though I didn't understand that yet. The first thing Gerald said about the house, within the first few weeks of living there, was that it could use some updating. Not unkindly. He said it the way someone says, "This old car just needs some work," affectionately, with a slight edge of condescension toward the thing being described. He mentioned the kitchen. the bathroom, the porch railing, which was, admittedly, still listing to the left. My mother said she liked the house the way it was. Gerald said of course, and that was that. For a while. The second thing Gerald said, maybe 3 months into living there, was that he had been thinking about how the property was titled. He brought it up at dinner. My mother told me this later, in a phone call that I did not flag as significant at the time because I had no reason to. He said that since they were married now, it might make sense for the deed to reflect that. He said something about how the house should feel like theirs, not just hers. He framed it as romance, as commitment, as the logical extension of the vows they had just said. My mother said she'd think about it. And she did think about it. For 3 years, quietly, she thought about it. Here is the thing about a slow erosion. You don't see it happening because each individual change is small enough to explain away. Gerald started attending my mother's Sunday dinners. That was fine, more than fine, I expected it. He was her husband. The table had always fit more than 2. But somewhere in the second year, the Sunday dinners became something else. They became Gerald's forum. He would talk, at length, about the neighborhood, about properties he had noticed, about the investment value of craftsman homes in Northeast Portland, about what this house could be worth if someone updated the kitchen and addressed the foundation issues, which he had begun to mention with increasing frequency, though no structural engineer had ever been called. He would ask me questions about my work in a way that felt more like inventory than curiosity, as if he were cataloging my resources. He once asked, very casually, whether I ever worked on estate matters at the firm. I said sometimes. He nodded and moved on. I didn't think about it again for years. He started calling my mother Ruthie. She had always been Ruth. She had never been Ruthie. I watched her not correct him 3 or 4 times before I realized she had made a decision, somewhere, to let that one go. He reorganized the garage. This sounds harmless. He told my mother he was just creating more storage. What he actually did was box up my father's tools, my father's workbench, his toolbox, his levels and drill bits, and the old belt sander that had sat on that bench since 1984, and put them in unmarked cardboard boxes in the corner. My mother mentioned this to me with a careful neutrality that I recognized, only in retrospect, as the voice she used when she had already decided not to make an issue of something, but needed to say it out loud to someone anyway. I said, "Did you want me to bring the toolbox to my apartment?" She said, "No, it's fine, leave it." Gerald began referring to the house as our place in conversation with other people. This is not remarkable for a married couple, but there was something in the way he said it, a slight emphasis, a sense of declaration, that I noticed and filed away without knowing what to do with. In 2013, Gerald's son Gregory visited from Sacramento. He stayed for a long weekend, and I met him at a dinner my mother cooked. Gregory was 34, stocky, quiet in the way that is not the same as thoughtful. He walked through the house with his father after dinner in the way that a person walks through a house when they are thinking about it rather than being in it. He stood in the doorway of my mother's bedroom and looked at the ceiling. He commented on the square footage of the lot. He said, to no one in particular, that the back garden was underutilized. My mother heard him say it and said nothing. On Sunday nights, after those dinners, I started taking note of things. I am a paralegal. I am trained to document. I did not, at first, think of what I was doing as documentation. I thought of it as talking to myself, processing the low-level discomfort I felt every time I left that house. But I kept a note on my phone. Small observations, dates, things said. The way Gerald had mentioned, twice in 1 month, that a neighbor's property had recently been retitled following a marriage, and that it had simplified things considerably when it came to the estate. I did not know what I was building toward, but I kept the notes. And then, in the spring of 2014, I heard something that I was not meant to hear. I need to tell you about the cedar box first, and then I'll come back to what I overheard, because the cedar box is where this story actually turns. My mother kept a cedar box on the top shelf of her bedroom closet. It had been there my entire life. It was maybe 18 inches long, 10 inches wide, with a simple brass clasp that had gone slightly green with age. As a child, I had, of course, investigated it. I found, at various times over the years, her marriage certificate to my father, his discharge papers from the army, my and Kevin's birth certificates, a letter from her own mother that I was not supposed to read but did, a lock of hair in a paper envelope that I didn't ask about, an old photograph of two young women I didn't recognize, and a small collection of greeting cards. My mother's private life lived in that cedar box. I knew it was there. I knew it was hers. I never touched it without being asked. The morning after the funeral, after I had stood on the porch and watched the locksmith, after Gerald had watched me from behind the storm door, after the 11 phone calls, I drove to my Aunt Carol's house in Selwood, where she had been staying since flying in for the service. I sat at Carol's kitchen table, and I drank coffee, and I told Carol what had happened with the locks. Carol set her mug down very carefully. She looked at me. She said, "Diane, before she went into the hospital the last time, your mother gave me something to give to you." She left the kitchen. She came back with a cedar box. My mother had brought it to Carol's 3 weeks before she died. She had told Carol to give it to me directly, not to Kevin, not to anyone else, to me, and only after she was gone. I sat with the box in my lap for a long moment before I opened it. Everything I expected was inside: the certificates, the old photograph, the cards, and at the bottom, beneath everything else, a plain white envelope sealed with my name written on it in my mother's handwriting. Diane, just that. Inside the envelope were two things. The first was a handwritten letter, 4 pages, which I am not going to read to you in full because it is mine, and because some of it is private in ways I am still not ready to share. But what I will tell you is that the letter explained, in my mother's clear and straightforward way, that she had made a decision 3 years earlier that she had been afraid to tell me about. She said she had been afraid because she didn't want me to worry, or to confront Gerald, or to make things harder in the time she had left. She said she needed to know that the house would be there for me. She said, "I know what the house is. I know what it meant to your father and what it means to you. I am not going to let it disappear." The second thing was a copy of a deed. A deed to the house on Sycamore Lane, filed with Multnomah County 3 years earlier, in 2016, adding my name, Diane Ruth Calloway, as a joint tenant with right of survivorship. My mother had gone to a title company on Morrison Street, alone, and she had done this quietly, legally, correctly, without telling anyone. I am a paralegal. I knew immediately what joint tenancy with right of survivorship meant. I knew it better than most people who encounter it in a document and have to ask. It meant that when my mother died, her interest in the property did not pass through her estate. It did not go through probate. It did not go to Gerald by operation of their marriage, because a joint tenancy supersedes the right of a surviving spouse to claim a separately owned property under those conditions. It meant the house was already mine. It had been mine, legally, for 3 years. Gerald had changed the locks on a house he did not own. I set the deed down on Carol's kitchen table. I pressed my hands flat against it. Carol was watching me. She said, very quietly, "She told me you'd know what to do with it." I did not cry in that moment. I thought about my mother, alone on a Tuesday or a Thursday, walking into that title company on Morrison Street with her purse and her reading glasses and her quiet, decisive certainty. I thought about her sitting across from some stranger at a desk and signing her name, and then going home and putting the copy in the cedar box and saying nothing. I thought about what it must have taken to do that, how she must have been watching, what she must have known. Then I picked up my phone and called the attorney I trusted most at the firm where I worked, a woman named Patricia Nguyen who had been doing property law in Multnomah County for 22 years. I said, "Pat, I need an appointment. Tomorrow, first thing." She said, "I'll be here." I want to tell you about the week between finding the deed and getting into an attorney's office, because that week was its own particular kind of suffering that I think deserves to be named. I could not go home. I was staying at Carol's house in Selwood, sleeping in her guest room, wearing borrowed clothes, because the house I had grown up in had a new lock I didn't have a key to. Gerald did not return my calls. After that one phone call, "Diane, this is a legal matter now, you should speak to an attorney," he did not pick up again. He had retained a lawyer named Douglas Harker, whose name I found out when a letter arrived at Carol's address, forwarded from my apartment. I didn't even know Gerald knew my apartment address. A letter in a stiff ivory envelope explaining that the estate of Ruth Calloway Fitch was currently being administered, and that any inquiries regarding the property at Sycamore Lane should be directed to Harker and Associates. I read that letter 3 times, the estate of Ruth Calloway Fitch, her name, and then his. I sat with that letter and thought about my mother signing her name at the title company. I thought about what she had seen coming. My brother Kevin called me on the 3rd day. Kevin is not a complicated man. He is decent and slightly passive and easily led by whoever is nearest him, a quality that had, over the years, made him sympathetic to whoever spoke to him most recently. Gerald had called Kevin before Kevin called me. I could tell by the way Kevin spoke. He was not unkind. He said he was sorry for everything, for the loss of Mom, for the situation. He said he just thought maybe it was worth trying to work things out with Gerald directly, without attorneys. He said Gerald seemed reasonable. I said, "Kevin, Gerald changed the locks the morning after Mom's funeral." Kevin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know, but maybe he was just scared or confused about the legal stuff." I said, "He retained an attorney before the burial was done." Another pause. Then, "I just think, fighting is expensive and Mom would have wanted peace." I said, "Kevin, I love you. I'm going to call you when this is resolved." And I hung up. I don't say that proudly. Kevin is my brother and I love him, and he is not a bad person. But in that moment, I understood that he was not going to be a resource, and I needed to protect the information I had, and so I kept my distance. That week I drove past the house on Sycamore twice. I don't know exactly why. I sat in my car at the top of the block and looked at it. The porch light was off. That was the detail that got me. The porch light was off, and I sat there and felt it. The physical weight of it. That light had been on every Sunday evening I had driven up to that house for 15 years. And now it was off, and my mother was gone, and a man I had once found pleasant was inside that house treating it like a thing he had won. I drove back to Carol's. On the 7th day after the funeral, I walked into Patricia Nguyen's office with the original deed, the copy from the cedar box, my mother's letter, and the notes I had been keeping on my phone for 2.5 years. Patricia read the deed first. She looked up at me and said, "Where did you find this?" I told her. She looked back down at the deed. She turned it over. She said, "Diane, this changes everything." I said, "I know." She said, "He doesn't know this exists." I said, "He cannot know, not yet." She nodded slowly. She said, "Tell me everything from the beginning." So I did. Her name was Margaret Osei. She was 64 years old, Ghanaian American, retired from a career as a high school vice principal, and she had lived in the house directly across the street from my mother on Sycamore Lane for 18 years. She had what she called a principal's memory, by which she meant she had spent decades professionally observing people, cataloging behavior, noticing what others missed and never said out loud. She was sharp and precise, and she did not exaggerate. I had known Margaret my whole life. She had given me a card when I graduated high school. She had come to my father's funeral. When my mother got sick, when the diagnosis came, 2 years before she died, Margaret had quietly, without being asked, begun leaving things on my mother's porch. Soup, bread, flowers from her own garden. She never made a production of it. I went to see Margaret on the 8th day, 2 days after my meeting with Patricia. I told her where things stood, in general terms. I told her I was fighting to keep the house, and that I might need her to share what she had seen over the years, if she was willing. Margaret poured tea into 2 cups and set the pot down and said, "Tell me what you need to know." I asked her about Gerald, about what she had observed. She was quiet for a moment, choosing her words in the way that precise people choose their words, not searching for what to say, but deciding how much. Then she said, "That first year he was visible. He was out front. He waved. He was social, the way someone is social when they want to be noticed being social. After that, he became very quiet. The kind of quiet that's not peaceful. He started receiving visitors, men I didn't recognize, not friends, more like colleagues. They'd come on weekday afternoons when your mother was at her garden club or her appointments. They'd go inside and come out maybe an hour later with folders." I asked if she had dates. She smiled. "I taught high school for 30 years, she said. I kept a calendar." Margaret went to a drawer and produced a small spiral notebook. She did not hand it to me. She held it and read from it dates, notes, descriptions of vehicles she had seen. 2 specific dates in 2015 stood out. Both times, a man Margaret described as heavyset, 50s, driving a silver sedan, had visited the house on weekday afternoons. The second visit, in September 2015, had lasted nearly 2 hours. Patricia, when I told her this, identified the timeline as significant. In November 2015, Gerald had first approached my mother had told me this in the letter, about formally adding him to the deed as a full joint owner, something more comprehensive than what they already had as a married couple. This was distinct from what my mother had quietly done in 2016. Gerald had wanted co-ownership documented formally, in a way that would supersede my mother's prior arrangements. He had wanted his name primary on that deed. My mother had stalled, and in 2016, she had quietly done what she had done. What Gerald had been doing in 2015, with those visits, with those men with folders, Patricia believed he had been laying groundwork, researching what could be done with the property, what a surviving spouse could claim, what could be transferred, and how. He had spent a year building his case in private before ever raising it with my mother. He was a retired commercial real estate broker. He understood property titles. He knew exactly what he was doing. Margaret Ose agreed to make herself available to Patricia as a witness if the matter proceeded to a legal proceeding. She signed a statement. She handed Patricia her spiral notebook, her precise, dated, 30-year vice principal for details spiral notebook, and said, quietly but with considerable weight, "Ruth Calloway was my neighbor and my friend for 18 years. I would like you to use that. I want to tell you about the last Sunday dinner before my mother went into the hospital for the final time. This was 6 weeks before she died. She was not well, we both knew it, though we had reached the point where the knowing sat between us quietly without needing to be said every moment. She was tired in a way that was different from ordinary tired. She moved more slowly. She sat down more often. But she had made pot roast, because it was November and she said she wanted the house to smell right. Gerald was there, but he went upstairs after dinner. He said he had calls to return. My mother and I sat at the kitchen table with our wine, and the candle she'd lit for the table and the last of the pot roast in the pot on the stove, and we talked for almost 3 hours. She told me things she had never told me before, about the early years with my father, about how she had felt after he died, not grief exactly at first, just incomprehension, like someone had removed a wall and I kept reaching for it. She talked about Gerald carefully, in a way that was not complaining and not excusing but something else, a measured, honest accounting. She said, "I know he's not what I thought he was, but I made a choice and I kept it. I'm not sorry I didn't spend these years alone." She said it the way someone says something they have worked through all the way to the end. I asked her if she was scared. She said, "No, I'm sad, those are different." We washed the dishes together. I dried and she put them away because she still knew where everything went, and I always put things in the wrong cabinet. She said, while putting the serving dish away, "The house is going to be all right, Diane. I need you to trust me about that." At the time, I thought she meant emotionally, that the house would hold, that its memory would survive. I said I trusted her. I kissed her on the cheek and I said goodnight, and I drove home with the porch light glowing in my rearview mirror until I turned the corner and it was gone. That was the last Sunday dinner. 6 weeks later, she was in the hospital. 3 weeks after that, she was gone. I have thought about that conversation almost every day since. The way she said the house is going to be all right, the certainty in it. She already knew what she had done. She had already filed that deed. She was telling me, in the only way she could without telling me, that she had taken care of it. That is the woman I am fighting for. Not a saint, she made her compromises. She kept her silences when she should have spoken. She let Gerald into that house, and some part of her must have known who he was before I did. But she saw, clearly, what was coming. And in her quiet and private way, she did what she could. I was not going to let her work come to nothing. Let me tell you what Gerald's attorney had filed. Patricia obtained copies within the first 2 weeks. Douglas Harker, on behalf of Gerald Fitch, had filed a claim asserting that as the surviving spouse and sole occupant of the property at Sycamore Lane, Gerald was the rightful owner of the home outright. The claim was based on the original deed as it had stood when my parents owned the property, my mother's name, sole owner after 2003, since my father's interest had passed to her Clenley. It was based on the premise that no subsequent changes to the deed existed. Because Gerald did not know about the subsequent changes to the deed. This is the part that requires some explanation for people who aren't familiar with how real property records work in Oregon. When my mother walked into that title company in 2016 and added my name as a joint tenant, that document was filed with Multnomah County. It became public record. It was not hidden. Any title search would have found it. A retired commercial real estate broker with his professional background should have either found it or had someone find it. Gerald had not run a title search, or if he had run one before 2016 and not updated it. Or, and Patricia believed this was most likely, he had assumed my mother would never do something like that without telling him. He had believed that the house was simply and uncomplicated his by virtue of his marriage and his surviving her, and he had acted on that belief before verifying it. He had changed the locks on a house he assumed he owned. He had retained a lawyer to assert ownership of a house he had never verified he owned. He had sent my mother's daughter a letter through his attorney telling her to direct all inquiries through counsel for a property that was, at the moment, he wrote that instruction, already half mine under existing county records. Patricia filed our response to Harker and Associates on a Tuesday morning in February, 14 days after my mother's funeral. It was a measured, thorough filing. It included the deed. It included the full title history. It included the county filing receipt. It included a request that Mr. Fitch and his counsel cease any activity suggesting sole ownership of the property and arrange for Diane Calloway to be provided access to the property of which she was a documented co-owner. Patricia told me she had seen Harker at a filing window once before and that he was competent but not exceptional. She said competent but not exceptional attorneys, when surprised by a document they should have known existed, sometimes made errors in their response. She said, "Let's see what they do." What they did was nothing for 11 days. And then Harker filed a challenge asserting that the 2016 deed modification had been made without proper notification to the spouse and might constitute a unilateral alteration of marital property. Patricia read this filing and smiled, not a warm smile, a professional one. She said, "Oregon is not a community property state." She was right. Oregon follows the separate property doctrine, meaning that property owned by one spouse before a marriage or acquired individually, and critically, property already titled in one spouse's name, is generally that spouse's to manage. My mother had owned that house since 2003. She had the right to modify the title of her own separate property. Gerald's consent was not required. Patricia wrote a 6-paragraph response that I believe based on the silence that followed it, stopped Douglas Harker cold. I need to be honest with you about this part. I thought when we filed the deed that it would be quick, that the facts would speak clearly and the matter would resolve. That Gerald would see the document, understand what it meant, and the thing would end. It did not end quickly. I want you to know that before I tell you the rest, because if you're sitting at home and you're in your own version of this story, and some of you are, I know you are, I've heard from you before, I don't want to give you a false picture of how clean it was. Gerald did not surrender. A man who had spent a year building a quiet strategy before ever showing it to my mother was not going to read one filing and walk away. What happened next was 3 months of procedural combat that I am going to condense because the details are tedious and the emotion underneath them is not. Patricia and I met every week, sometimes twice. I brought everything. I had my phone notes from 2.5 years of Sunday dinners, the dates I had noted when Gerald had brought up the deed, the timeline of his conversations with my mother that she had described in her letter, Margaret Osai's statement, and her spiral notebook. Patricia also requested financial records related to the property, not income, not savings, but records of any improvements Gerald had allegedly made since he had begun in his own filings to assert that he had contributed to the property in ways that entitled him to a greater claim. This is called the improvement claim, and it is a real legal theory, but it requires documentation. Gerald's documentation was thin. What he could show was some landscaping work in the back garden, a new kitchen faucet, and the installation of a ceiling fan in the main bedroom. Patricia said, without inflection, "A faucet." I said, "A faucet." We sat with that for a moment. The real difficulty, the thing that cost me sleep and wore it something in me during those 3 months, was not the legal strategy. Patricia had the legal strategy. The difficulty was the waiting and the grief and the fact that I was fighting for a house I could not go into. I was fighting for a place that was mine on paper while someone else lived in it. I drove past it. I sat in my car at the top of the block. The porch light stayed off. My Aunt Carol checked on me every few days. She did not offer advice. She brought food and sat with me and watched old movies and said nothing that required response. That was the right thing. I want to acknowledge it. Carol Harmon, my mother's younger sister, was the quiet support that kept me functional during those 3 months. She did not fully understand the legal situation. She did not need to. She understood that her niece was in pain and needed to not be alone with it, and she showed up accordingly. There was a moment, sometime in March, when Patricia called me to tell me that Harker had filed a motion that, while it was ultimately frivolous, would require a response and would delay things by several more weeks. I was in my car in a parking garage when she called. I sat in the car after we hung up and I put my head back against the headrest and I thought, very clearly, I don't know if I can keep doing this. Not permanently, just in that moment. That was the moment I almost quit, not from the fight, but from my ability to believe it was worth the cost. The cost in time and energy and grief, and the constant low hum of having to be competent and strategic about something that was also, underneath all the legal language, the loss of my mother, the loss of my father's house, the loss of the porch light being on. I sat in the parking garage for maybe 20 minutes, and then I thought about my mother at that title company on Morrison Street, alone, signing her name, filing her document, putting the copy in the cedar box and saying nothing. She had done her part quietly, years in advance, asking nothing of me. The least I could do was keep going. I started the car. The deposition of Gerald Allen Fitch took place on a Wednesday morning in April, in a conference room at Patricia's office building, with a court reporter present and Douglas Harker seated beside his client. I was not in the room. Patricia did not want me in the room, and she was right, my presence would have been a distraction for both Gerald and for me. I sat in the waiting area with Carol, who had taken the morning off from whatever she had planned to be there, and I waited. Gerald was in that conference room for 2 hours and 40 minutes. I want to tell you the parts that Patricia reported to me afterward, because some of them were important legally, and some of them were important to me personally. The legally important part: Gerald, under oath, stated that he had not been aware of any deed modification made by his wife after their marriage. He stated this as a simple fact, that to his knowledge, the deed had remained unchanged since he moved into the house. Patricia had, at this point, already obtained through public records a copy of every title-related inquiry made on the Sycamore Lane property, including one, a preliminary title report, ordered by a real estate consulting firm in early 2017. Meaning someone, connected to Gerald or to his interests, had run a title search in early 2017. Meaning the 2016 deed modification would have appeared in that search. Meaning Gerald's statement that he had not been aware of the deed modification was, at minimum, in serious tension with the documented existence of a title search that would have shown it to him. Patricia placed the title report in front of him during the deposition and asked him to explain the relationship between the consulting firm that had ordered it and himself. Gerald said he wasn't familiar with the firm. Patricia asked if he had ever had any professional or personal relationship with anyone at that firm. Gerald said he didn't believe so. Patricia then produced, and I want to give you the specific sensation of what Patricia described to me afterward, sitting across from her in her office, watching her almost smile as she said it. A printout from a professional networking site showing Gerald Fitch, listed as a former business associate of the founding partner of the consulting firm, a relationship that dated to his years in commercial real estate, and that was documented in the firm's own publicly available history. Harker called for a break at that point. The personally important part, the part that is harder to hold and that I think about differently than the legal piece, was something Patricia told me almost as an aside. She said, "He talked about your mother." I said, "What did he say?" She paused. She said, "He said she was a difficult woman to understand, that she made decisions unilaterally, that he had always tried to be reasonable with her and she made it hard." I sat with that for a long moment. My mother, who had kept his name, kept his dinner warm, let him call her Ruthie, let him box up my father's toolbox, who had chosen, against what I believe were her better instincts, to make her peace with this man for the years she had remaining. My mother, who had been lonely and who had made the choice to let someone in, and who had paid a price for that choice in the private, daily ways that no deposition testimony would ever touch. He called her difficult to understand. I breathed through it. I put it somewhere to deal with later. Then I asked Patricia what happened next. She said, "We're in a very good position. But you should know he's not going to settle easily. He's going to make us take this to a hearing." I said, "Fine, let's take it to a hearing." The hearing was held on a Thursday morning in May, 7 months after my mother died, in a courtroom in downtown Portland, before a judge named Honorable Patricia Way Different Patricia. I always note that there were 2 Patricias on my side of this, which I choose to find meaningful. I am not going to give you a scene-by-scene account of the hearing because this is not a courtroom drama, and because, frankly, the law is less cinematic than people expect. What I will tell you is what mattered. Patricia Nguyen presented the deed. She presented the title history. She presented the county filing records, showing the date and proper execution of the 2016 modification. She presented Margaret Osai's statement. She presented the documentation linking Gerald to the title search from 2017. She presented the deposition transcript with Gerald's denial and the professional network documentation that complicated that denial. Harker argued that the 2016 modification had been made without proper transparency to a spouse, and that this raised questions about intent. Patricia responded that intent was not the legal standard here. Proper execution was the standard, and the document had been properly executed, properly witnessed, properly notarized, and properly filed. She also noted that Oregon's separate property doctrine applied cleanly to a home that had been titled solely in my mother's name since 2003, predating the marriage by 8 years. Judge Wei asked a number of questions, mostly procedural, one pointed. The pointed one was directed at Harker. Counsel, are you asserting that the 2016 deed modification was improperly executed? Harker said he was raising questions about the circumstances. Judge Wei said, that's not what I asked. There was a pause. Harker said, no, Your Honor, we are not asserting improper execution. That was the moment. Not dramatic, quiet and contained, and absolutely decisive. Judge Wei's ruling came down 6 days later in writing. I was at work when Patricia forwarded it to me. I read it at my desk. The modification was valid. The joint tenancy with right of survivorship had transferred my mother's interest in the property to me automatically upon her death. Gerald Fitch had no claim to the property at Sycamore Lane. The ruling included a specific order. Gerald was to vacate the property within 30 days and provide Diane Calloway with all keys, including any copies made, within 10 days of the order date. I read that paragraph twice. I texted Carol, it's done. Carol called me immediately and I answered, and she started crying before she said anything, which made me start crying, and we sat on the phone together for about 3 minutes not saying very much, and that was fine. That was exactly right. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. I felt something closer to exhausted relief. The kind that comes after something long and grinding finally ends, not joy exactly, but the end of bracing. The unclenching of something you didn't fully know you'd been clenching. I thought about my mother. I thought about the title company on Morrison Street, and the cedar box, and the porch light. I thought about what she had said on our last Sunday dinner. The house is going to be all right. The quiet certainty of it. The faith she had placed in a document and in me. I know, Mom, I thought, you were right. Let me tell you what happened. Gerald Fitch vacated the property on the 27th of the 30 days he was given. He did not contact me. He arranged, through Harker, for a time to collect his belongings, and Carol and I were not present for that. Patricia advised us to let the process happen without conflict, and she was right. He took his things and he left, and we got the keys from Harker's office by certified process, which is exactly as formal and impersonal as it sounds, and was, I think, the appropriate register for all of it. Gerald's son Gregory, in Sacramento, apparently called my brother Kevin at some point during all this. Kevin told me about it weeks later, sheepishly, like a man reporting on a conversation he'd had in a dream. Gregory had said apparently that his father had been treated unfairly. Kevin had said he was sorry to hear that, which is very Kevin. Kevin called me afterward and said he was sorry. I said I knew. He said he should have asked better questions at the beginning. I said yes, but it was all right. And it is all right mostly. Kevin and I are careful with each other in a way we weren't before. I think that's honest at least. Douglas Harker, I heard secondhand, dropped Gerald as a client after the ruling. I don't know the reason. I don't need to. Gerald moved to Sacramento. That's all I know about that. The house needed work. Not as much as Gerald had always implied. His narrative of the house's deterioration had been exaggerated, as I suspected, but real work. The kitchen needed updating, which I had always known. The porch railing needed to be properly rebuilt. The garden in the back, which Gerald had described as underutilized, had actually been tended by my mother for 20 years and was, to my eye, completely and exactly what it should be. I hired a contractor for the kitchen and for the porch. The porch railing took 2 weeks. The contractor found in the corner of the garage a toolbox in an unmarked cardboard box. My father's toolbox. She left it where it was, thinking it was hers to move. I asked her not to. I moved it myself, back to the workbench where it had always been. I did not move into the house immediately. I'm not sure I can explain exactly why, a combination of practicality and grief, and a sense that moving in too quickly would be the wrong rhythm for what the house needed from me. I have my apartment. I kept it. But I am in the house on Sycamore Lane most Sundays. The cedar box is on my kitchen table right now. I moved it from the shelf in my mother's closet to my kitchen table in my apartment because I wanted it somewhere I could see it. I don't open it every day. Most days I just see it and that's enough. I kept the deed. Obviously. It is in a fireproof document box with my own copies of everything relevant to the property. I kept the letter. I have read it many times. It doesn't say anything I didn't already know about my mother, but reading it is still, every time, a conversation with her. That is the only way I know how to describe it. She is still in that letter. The exact cadence of how she thought, the way she arrived at something and then just stated it simply without preamble. She loved me. She worried about me. She thought I worked too hard. She thought I should plant something. She was very clear about this, almost insistent. 2 full sentences about the importance of having a plant that you are responsible for keeping alive. I have not yet done this. I intend to. I kept the photograph I had always found in the cedar box. The 2 young women I didn't recognize. I asked Carol finally, and she told me they were my mother and a girl named Frances who had been her best friend in childhood, who died young. My mother kept that photograph for 60 years in a cedar box on a closet shelf. She never talked about Frances, but she kept her. That is the kind of person my mother was, the keeping kind. The porch light at the house on Sycamore Lane is working now. I replaced the bulb on the first Sunday I was back in the house alone. I turned it on when the sun went down, and I sat on the porch with a glass of wine, and I looked at the street. The light was on. I was home. I am not going to tell you that I am at peace with all of it. I'm not. There is something about knowing what Gerald did, the slow, patient, deliberate way he worked to position himself, the years of quiet maneuvering before he ever showed his hand, that I carry differently than I carry ordinary grief. Grief softens. What Gerald did sits in a different place. I know it was not unique. I know other families have experienced versions of this. And that knowledge does not make it smaller, but it does make it less isolating. What I want to say to you, if you're watching this, and you recognize something in this story, is this. Document everything. I know that sounds cold when you are inside a family situation, when you want to believe in the best of people, when keeping notes on your phone feels like a betrayal of the trust that should exist in a family. Document anyway. Not aggressively, not combatively, just quietly, the way my mother quietly walked into a title company and signed her name. You don't know what you're building toward. Neither did I, but those notes mattered. The timeline mattered. The dates Margaret kept in her spiral notebook mattered. Know your rights. I was a paralegal. I had an advantage. But you don't need a legal background to find out how property works in your state, how a deed can be modified, what joint tenancy means, what a surviving spouse can and cannot claim depending on how the title reads. This information exists. It is public. It is findable. My mother found it on her own, and she was a retired woman who grew up in Medford, Oregon and liked hydrangeas and made pot roast on November Sundays. And find your Patricia Nguyen. Find the person in your life, a professional, a family member, a neighbor with a spiral notebook and a principal's memory, who will sit across from you and say, "Tell me everything from the beginning." And then tell them. Don't leave things out because they seem too small. My mother's Sunday dinner observations, which I had not thought of as evidence, mattered in the end. The bittersweet part, and I will not hide from it, because this story asked me for honesty, and I owe you that, is that the house came back but my mother did not. The house on Sycamore Lane is mine. I can walk in on a Sunday evening and cook pot roast if I want and sit at the kitchen table where she picked the paint chip in 1991, and where we had 15 years of dinners, and where I last saw her face in good light. I can do all of that. But she is not there. She did the work and she is not there to see it resolve. I think about that. I don't think it goes away. What I have instead is the knowledge that she anticipated it, that she took care of it, that she trusted me to carry it through, and I did. The house is still sage green. The porch is level now, the railing repaired, no longer listing to the left. My father's toolbox is back on the workbench in the garage. And on Sunday evenings, when I drive up Sycamore Lane, the porch light is on. It's always on now. If this story meant something to you, if any part of it felt familiar, or gave you something to think about, or if you've been through something like this in your own family, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments. Those comments are the reason I keep coming back here and telling these stories. They remind me that what happened to us, what happened to my mother, is not as rare or as invisible as it should be. Subscribe if you want to hear the next one. And take care of yourselves. That's all.